Welcome to Move Conversations. This is your host, Venkat. In this edition of Move Conversations, I talk to Miss Michele Wucker, well-known author of the book, The Gray Rhino, How to Recognize and Act on Obvious Dangers We Ignore. She also gave a very popular TED Talk on the same theme in 2019 that has garnered about 2.5 million views. She is the founder of Gray Rhino and Company. More recently, she published yet another book, You Are What You Risk, which we will discuss with her in the next part of our conversation. Michele started her career in financial media, but subsequently she worked in the Chicago Council of Global Affairs and was the president of the World Policy Institute. She has been interviewed in CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, Fox News, and you name it. Her book, The Gray Rhino, is the #1 best-selling English language book in China and a #1 Amazon bestseller in financial risk management category. There is more significance to the popularity of her book in China, and we will talk about it soon. But more recently, the well-known K-pop group BTS, their smash hit album B, has a track, Blue and Gray, which has the lines, a gray rhino that is coming towards me. Absently, I stand with vacant eyes. Welcome to Move Conversations, Michele. You have crossed the generation divide and inspired even the K-pop boy bands.
Thank you. I have to say, like, all the policy influence is like, that got me excited, but I've got cred with my nieces and nephews now with BTS. So that's exciting on a whole new level. So I'm really, really excited, but also because, it's about depression and anxiety, which is something that is such a huge issue, particularly over the past 18 months.
Sure.
And so I'm really glad that they're using the idea to bring attention to something that we really need to take a fresh look at and do something about. So super grateful for that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So many of our viewers and listeners are familiar with the term Black Swan, which are hard to predict or of low probability occurrence, but have a high impact. But you say gray rhinos are highly probable, high impact threats, but are neglected or ignored. So these are not about mid-air collisions between an asteroid and an aeroplane, but about known but ignored dangers. So please explain the concept and of course, how do you chose how you chose that metaphor?
Yeah, well, the cover of the book kind of says it. Imagine this big gray rhino in front of you. It's 2 tons. It's got a horn. It's really scary, and it's coming at you. And it gives you a choice of what are you going to do. And the subtitle says ignored, and we put that in because when we were first talking to editors in the United States, they said, what do you mean we don't pay attention to obvious things? Why do you need a book to talk about obvious things? Because if they're obvious, we're dealing with them. That's, of course, so American. It's like, what do you mean? Well, of course, we know what we're doing. And so, the idea was never really about the ignored part of it. It was that, we have the elephant in the room for that. That's the thing that by definition is ignored. And so my point with ignored is that you're more likely to get trampled than you think. And so we sort of corrected for the way that people didn't understand that we need a fresh look at the obvious. And now I've been trying in my language to recorrect for what apparently was an overcorrection. But the definition really is, obvious, probable, high impact, like a big rhino coming at you. And I really wanted to create that emotional connection. That's what the metaphor is for. And the gray part of it is because all rhinos are gray. But if you study them a little bit, there's something called a black rhino and there's something called a white rhino. The black one's not actually black and the white one's not actually white. Yeah. It's gray. So that's kind of a metaphor for the, for the not paying enough attention to the thing that's really obvious part of it. So that's where the gray came from.
No, that's very nice because it's all shades of gray, right? And especially all these issues, they're all having shades of gray, right? It's not like very clear, very distinct, right? So
it's true. And actually appreciating the gray is I think part of really embracing the metaphor, because another thing I think is very American. I mean, everybody does it to some degree, but we're particularly guilty of it in the United States, is this, idea of, if you don't know something absolutely that's absolutely specifically predictable, like if you don't know that the stock market is going to fall by 3% on September 9th, then you don't know. And so actually dealing with gray rhinos, it's coming at you. You don't know exactly how everything is going to play out, but you've got a pretty good picture of the parameters. And so that shades of gray actually, I think, adds some nice nuance to the metaphor as well.
Absolutely. So what you're saying is, like, issues like climate change, cyber attacks, disruptive technologies, financial crisis, including wildfires, all of these things are highly obvious but ignored threats, right? So
but
in your
the key
book,
part is not necessarily ignored. Some people are paying attention to them.
Yeah,
People
exactly.
are talking about them, and it's just that, some people, just turn the other way, and some people do something, and that's really the crux of it. Is that what makes the difference between the people who see the obvious thing and actually keep their eyes on it and do something about it, and the ones who are like, well, it's obvious, of course we're dealing with it, so we'll just like push it off to the side and let somebody else deal with it.
So that gives me a very good segue for me to ask, right? How do different people deal with this, the gray rhinos? And when I read your book, it seems to parallel the 5 stages of dealing with grief. Can you talk more about it?
Yeah, well, it's funny when you're writing a book, because of course, I started as a writer, and I was just up to my ears in books when I was a kid. So, the literary part of it is very important to me. And when you have a book, it's important to have a narrative arc to tell a story. And so as I was, pulling the book together, people would say, well, okay, so why don't people deal with this? And I realized that the answer depends on where you are in the stage of the crisis. And of course, it starts with denial. So I think of denial, of course, you think of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her 5 stages of grief. And so while there's a sort of an homage to her, and the 5 stages, are somewhat related to her 5 stages, but they're not quite the same. So it basically starts with denial, that goes to muddling, which is when you accept it's there, but you have 1,000 reasons not to do something about it. You have diagnosing, which is when you shift to, okay, what does it take and who's going to do it? And then there's the panic, which is it's when everybody's freaking out, which can be the reason to act, but it also too often is the reason to do the wrong thing. And then there's action, which doesn't just stop with acting. It includes tracking and making sure that what you did is having the result that you want, and adjusting if you need to. So different people tend to react, and different organizations and policymakers react differently at different stages. But then I realized, and this is something that I developed much more in You Are What You Risk, is that not everybody reacts the same way. And there are lots of really interesting sociological and cultural and other reasons that go into why people are very different in how they act. And of course, part of the premise of the Gray Rhino is that, people who consciously recognize that you might not have your eye on the rhino in front of you, those are the ones who are more likely to respond. And so the recognizing it is actually in many cases a conscious decision. And that's the most important thing about it.
Right. So you referred to policymakers. So, and Gray Rhino is the #1 best-selling English language book in China. It was seen on President Xi's bookshelf. Policymakers are known to read and talk about your book. In 2017, your concept famously crashed the Chinese stock market by 4 to 5%. How did you manage all these things?
Well, I have to say that, so much of the credit in China goes to CITIC, my publisher. I mean, they just did a fantastic job.
Right.
I mean, I think the central idea was really powerful and continues to be, and it becomes more and more and more relevant.
Mhm.
And, it's funny, at the very beginning of my career, when I was a financial journalist, and even when I was, training as a journalist, the mantra was, just tell the story.
Mm.
And, don't take sides, don't put your opinion into things. And very quickly, I'd be interviewing guys who were, trading Brady bonds and emerging markets debt, and, 25-year-old guys who didn't speak Spanish, and I was supposed to ask them about, what the finance minister of Ecuador was meant. And I was like,
Mm.
well, I speak Spanish and I just talked to him last week. What, there's something wrong with this, And so I very quickly switched into the, analysis and saying what I thought, which is of course exactly the opposite of what journalists are trained to do, but it's
Right.
changed a little bit these days. But
Right.
I started really thinking about impact, and I taught at Columbia University for a while, teaching policy master's students to think about, okay, what do you want to happen as a result of what you're saying?
Mhm.
And I have to say, I'm just so amazed at how uh, the Chinese economic policy establishment has sort of taken the idea and used it in ways that I really, I could only have dreamed of. And I remember when they came out, there's a story in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was in December of 2017, when someone in Beijing told the journal reporter, the United States is a gray rhino. And they were talking about the tax plan, and they actually changed their monetary policy. Someone on
Just.
Twitter, reached out. He was like, wow, you just changed Chinese monetary policy. And I was like, well, there were a lot of people putting a lot of, thought and research into that too. It wasn't just me. But I do think about that a lot when I write something, and I mentor young writers. And the first thing I ask a mentee is I say, who do you want to do different? Who do you want to do what differently because of what you've written?
Right.
And, the Gray Rhino is such a great example of it. And of course, ideas sometimes go out and they take on their own life,
Correct.
which has happened in a really beautiful way here.
So, building on that, I mean, we have seen crackdown on the big tech in China over the last many months. Would you say that the Chinese government saw some gray rhinos in the tech sector and is acting accordingly, or this is something else?
Also, there were a lot of references in the Chinese media, months and months ago, before
Mhm.
the actions were taken
Mhm.
in the last couple months.
Mm.
And I think it's something that, it's a discussion that policymakers around the world have certainly had their eyes on. I mean, in the States, we look at social media and dissemination of misinformation,
Mm.
and data privacy, and Europe's been very proactive on data privacy, although their GDPR has other problems of its own, which I won't
Yeah.
go into.
Yeah.
Carpal tunnel syndrome from clicking all of those stupid pop-ups on your
Oh
website.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and then even then they, slight, sort of digression maybe for others, but they just want you to accept lock, stock, and barrel, and even if they give you a menu of choices, it's not like that. Clear, and especially for people outside of EU, it doesn't give much sort of opt out.
Well, what worries me, and a couple people have written about this, is you have to click all those things, and that actually becomes very dangerous.
Hmm.
Like, you don't always know what you're clicking on. You think you're clicking on a little X close box. You could be agreeing to something you have no idea. It's not even up there what you've agreed to, and so that it actually creates all sorts of unintended problems. And I really think it needs to be revisited. But I think all around the world there are big social questions around technology. Kai-Fu Lee has written about a lot of these. I've spoken about some of the, really the bigger social questions about technology. I've often been asked by the Chinese media, about, data questions and some of the fights between some of the technology companies. And it's a huge issue. I think China has been, much more sort of, public and, forceful about it than other countries. But it's a question that people in countries all around the world need to deal with. And I think it's something that really needs a lot of global coordination because of the way information flows. I mean, it's you can create some barriers to information flowing across borders, but it's like water. It finds another way to go. So
Yeah.
it's a huge problem. And one of the things that has really impressed me about China, whether it's about financial risk, which is of course what I talk about a lot, and monetary policy, is the questions I get from the Chinese media are so much more forward looking and focused on these obvious problems than in the States. When I, in before times, before the pandemic started,
Yeah.
I was back and forth to China quite a bit, and it felt like whiplash, the risk conversations in China where people were very conscious of these financial risks. And then I come back to the United States and people were like, oh yeah, let's just pump some more air into these asset bubbles. And then the Western press would be like, oh yeah, China, boy, they've got a real problem. And I'm like, yeah, and they're talking about it, and it's a wicked problem. It's not easy to solve, but
Exactly.
they're actually paying attention to it. And like, if we paid enough attention to our own problems here, we might be more freaked out, but we also might be heading off bigger problems down the road.
So, you mentioned wicked problems and lack of attention to it. In that context, I love the quote from your book. Inertia is one of the most powerful forces preventing us from getting out of the way of a known challenge, right? And, I remember that I often used to tell my friends and also my students that I understood Newton's law of inertia better in professional and personal life than ever as a high school science student. Right. So even when we do recognize the existence of a clear and present danger, why business, government, and society do not act on them? Other than inertia, what else comes in the way?
Well, in many cases, it's the underlying personality. In many cases, it's the sort of peer pressure, the groupthink. I mean, nobody likes the person who raises the red flag. I've written recently about social risk, which is really what that is, saying the thing that actually benefits the company or the organization or the government to pay attention to, but nobody wants to hear it. So you're actually doing something good for the organization, but you get punished for it. They say no good deed goes unpunished. But also, incentives, they're all wrong. In the US, for example, we've got these, very short-term political cycles. And so, the minute somebody gets elected, they're raising money and thinking about the next cycle. The primary system where, you choose candidates before the main election is set up completely wrong so that only the most extreme people vote in those. You get a very small percentage of the population who's choosing those candidates.
Correct.
And the candidates cater to the most extreme people, and you're not getting the right people. And there's a group called Unite America that's actually working on this problem, trying to change the electoral system so it makes more room for the moderate, sensible voices, which is how a lot of Americans like to think of ourselves, even though the reality lately has not quite been that. So, the incentives, the key performance indicators in companies, the, quarterly reports, there's been a big movement on and off to get rid of the quarterly reports, to get companies to look longer term. And it's, and the set of reasons are slightly different for every person. And I go into that in a lot more detail in You Are What You Risk, but there are big, sort of structural, organizational, cultural, and cognitive things that get in the way. And my point is that once you start to be aware of those, you can start changing them to try to get the obstacles out of the way so that you can actually act more decisively and swiftly when you do see the gray rhino coming at you.
Right. And like the other point that you make later in the book is like, it could even be, what you perceive as a threat can even be opportunity. Like you give the example of TV networks, for them, internet began as a threat, but Yahoo, Google, etc. saw it very differently, and they saw it as an opportunity. So basically, gray rhinos can present opportunities to some, while others may see it as threats, right?
Absolutely. And that's so key. Or the discussion right now about ESG and climate change. You see that, the assets under management have more than doubled over the past 18 months. And that's really amazing. But then there are people who are trying to take advantage of it. But, one of the things I wrestled with the book was, I went to Africa. I went on safari. My accountant was totally okay with me deducting that expense. It was a very, very legitimate business expense on many levels.
Sure.
But, so, and I learned a lot more about the poaching crisis. And then I started feeling guilty that here I'm, depicting the gray rhino as this, big scary thing when actually humans are a bigger threat to rhinos than they are to
To us.
to us.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I started to really make that point very clearly. And then the funny thing is, all my friends started sending me these like videos of cute baby rhinos.
And
There's
they
one
are,
like playing with a goat, one playing with a puppy. They're absolutely,
yeah,
go to
cute.
YouTube. Just look
Yeah,
for baby rhino videos. Is the
right.
best thing. And so I talk about those baby rhinos now. It's like you want to pay
Save
attention to
them.
the problem when it's small and cute and you can actually do something about it, because
That's a
that's one
good
of the
metaphor.
paradoxes, is that the sooner you deal with something, the less it costs and the more likely you are to succeed. But unfortunately, when they're still small and manageable,
Mhm.
most people don't bother to pay attention, and that's one of the things that I'm trying to change.
Right. So, you also expand on Donald Rumsfeld's famous quote about known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And you added unknown known. Right? So, can you please explain how these are the gray rhinos?
Well, I think it goes back a little bit to the need for nuance that I was talking about before.
Right.
That no, you don't know exactly how everything is going to play out, but you've got a very big idea of the outline
Mhm.
and the nature of the problem.
Mhm.
And part of the reason that these things are unknown is because there's a feedback loop
Mhm.
that we're so used to talking about risk, doing a risk analysis, how
Right.
likely is this and whatever. And in many cases those likelihoods are just pulled straight out of the air. But there's a feedback loop that when you recognize the existence of a risk, when you decide to do something about it, that actually changes the outcome. And I think in some ways that's
Yeah.
part of why people are afraid of doing something, because if you predict that some catastrophe is going to happen and you go and you do the things that you need to do to prevent it. You look at, like, say, the Y2K bug.
Mhm.
People
Mhm.
people put a lot of hours and money into making sure that wasn't a problem. It
Right.
didn't turn out to be a big problem. We don't know if it wasn't a big problem in the first place or if it was because all of those
We
efforts
did all of that.
went.
Yeah. It
Now, of
depends
course,
on
the
who you ask,
conspiracy,
right?
yeah, the conspiracy theorists will, tell you, oh, it was all a hoax in the first place. But, people don't want to go and fix a problem and then get accused of, being a Cassandra or a Chicken Little
Right.
because they predicted a problem that didn't happen, when the fact that the problem didn't happen is actually evidence that they succeeded in doing what they're going to do.
Right. And in the context of prevention, which you spoke about now, and in the context of incentives that you spoke about earlier, um, to stop the gray rhinos isn't what should I say? Governance also an important thing. Like, you cite a fascinating experiment in the Indian state of Gujarat, and you say that when auditors received payment from a third party, but not the company that they were inspecting, and they received also even bonuses for accurate reports, they were 80% less likely to make false reports. Tell us more about what exactly happened, and
It's true.
what did they
It was
find?
such an amazing experiment. And, I think it goes to the importance of, key performance indicators of
Mhm.
who, what you're being rewarded for and who is rewarding you.
Mm.
The same could be said about, the ratings industry in
Mm.
general.
Yeah,
That, companies pay the rating industry. What if they were to, like, just pay into a pool and randomly get assigned the
correct.
rating agency? That could make a big difference. But in a situation where the company pays you to audit the books,
Mhm.
it's in your interest not to point to problems, because that's going to cause a big problem for the company, and they're going to be like, next time let's go to someone who makes it easier
Easier,
for
exactly.
us.
And some companies, some auditors have been doing it for like 20 years for the same company, right? Even Anderson and Enron you talked about, and then so are other cases, right, where they have been together for very, very long time.
Yeah, and it's, I think it makes sense to change things from time to time. It's either new techniques come in, seeing something with a fresh eye
Mhm.
will often help think. And it's not even that it was necessarily the fault of the previous auditor that they didn't see it. It's, it's like when you're doing a book. That's why you have an editor who hasn't had their head in a book for all this time. It's why you have a separate copy editor, you have a separate proofreader, you have beta readers, you have people who haven't seen it before, because that fresh eye is so powerful in
That's true.
spotting mistakes that it's just so much harder to see when you're on the inside.
Right, absolutely. So let's change gear a little bit and we talk about, there was a very interesting quote, and there are plenty of interesting quotes in your book. So the other one that sort of caught my eye was the Vladimir Popov, the Russian economist, and where you say that, like, what makes the most difference to a country's growth prospects is not the speed with which it reforms, but the strength of its decision-making process. And you discuss China's reforms, and you have a lot of engagement with China. So what are the strengths of its institutions and processes beyond what people say it's the authoritarian style of government?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Spending time in China has been amazing because there were, I started my career in Latin America and Europe, and hadn't really started going to China until I think 2010 or 11 was the first time. So about 10 years. So it's all, fairly new. And so, of course, the things that you hear in the States are all filtered through our own propaganda lenses. And,
It's interesting
my
that
friends,
as an American, you mentioned that.
it's one of those things that's, and like I love my country, but I think we need to be honest about ourselves. And actually, my friend Ann Lee has written a lot about what the U.S. can learn from China, and talks about sort of a civil service culture. And I think think there are the ability to look long term there, and you have people on all sides of the what kind of government is best argument. It's actually kind of interesting to me that some countries are very evangelical about their kind of government. They want everybody else to have the same kind, and it doesn't necessarily work for everyone else.
Correct.
And there's a certain different kind of accountability in that in the States, you kind of push the problem down to the next people. You can always like blame everything on the opposite party, but when you only have one party, you can't do that.
Can't do that. Yeah.
And there are pros and cons of both sides. I do think that in some cases, being comfortable saying, hey, we have a problem, which, paradoxically in China, with the embrace of the gray rhino concept, people are doing on certain issues much more than in the United States. But the ability to think long term, and also the realization that you're not going to be able to kick it down the road to the next person. So I think that there are channels of accountability that a lot of Westerners don't necessarily appreciate. And obviously there are pros and cons to every system.
True.
I would love to see something that combines the best of all systems, and gets rid of the sore spots of all systems. And one country is often willing to say, hey, well, look at that terrible thing that other country is doing, while ignoring that they do the same thing themselves. It might not be in the same context or the same scale, but it's kind of like people who live in glass houses. So I think that I think that a fresh-eyed look within every country at what's working and what doesn't is actually good, but that it be done in a constructive way. And we're not seeing that in the United States at all right now. It's just like a bunch of mudslinging.
Right. So we spoke about crisis and opportunities, but we talked about the television industry versus internet companies and so on. That is basically that two different entities can see a situation as crisis and opportunities differently. But one of the interesting things was you discussed the case of Portuguese cork industry, and where you say that you give it as an example of how even a old time industry, traditional industry, doesn't have to be new era industry. It is possible to convert a crisis into an opportunity. So what did they do right?
Well, it's very interesting. There were a couple things happening. One, so there were increasing reports of a cork taint, for
the wine bottles,
infection. Right? Yeah. But then at the same time, the sort of disruptors were coming in and particularly taking advantage of that, but saying, okay, our plastic corks or our screw-on tops don't have that same problem.
Right.
And they were very proactive in Portugal about upgrading, modernizing, really dealing with the problem and being open about it.
Mm.
And then also looking at other aspects of, cork being sustainable. It's
Yeah.
not made from fossil fuels. It's the things that you grow and harvest. And so I think they really did a good job in recognizing the problem
Mhm.
and gaining back some market share, because they looked, and the sustainability side of it, interesting, is another very good example of saying, here's a problem that we've got a solution for. So it's just sort of this intersection of environmental, climate, and specific industry problems and opportunities. And this, like, identifying what's the problem are you solving for. I mean, like, every VC pitch deck, that's what
Right.
they want to know. Or human-centered design is really about that. What's the problem that you're solving for, and really for your customers. What's
Right.
the problem you're solving for which group? Because different groups are going to define the problem in completely different ways.
Right. So when you say even a traditional industry can look at an oncoming rhino and look through what they have done over the years and what are the possibilities, and systematically try and work through and come out with new solutions to convert these into opportunity. So there's something that we try to do in our school, business school. So I teach in Singapore Management University, and my colleagues and I teach a course called Managing in a Volatile, Uncertain, Complex, and Ambiguous Context. And we introduce that course the triggers to VUCA and discuss strategies as well as thinking mindset that is required for the youngsters. The students also have to do a project to identify VUCA challenges faced by a public company, which is, not very different from, the case that you talked about of the Portuguese cork industry, just, looking at themselves and seeing like, hey, where have we gone wrong and what should we do? So, and then they are supposed to recommend strategies based on what they have learned and what they can see out there to deal with them. But one thing we find that, like, while many of them see that thing relevant, but some students still feel that they're doing this because it's a core course, it's a compulsory course and things like that. They're not sure of the value of learning to manage in a, this kind of a VUCA context. So I wanted, if you could have a message for students as well as business executives as to why this training in identifying gray rhinos, identifying VUCA challenges, and planning to deal with them is very important.
Well, there's actually a study that came out a couple years ago that I quote in You Are What You Risk, and also I wrote about it in my strategy and business column in a very popular article. And they from a group called Leaders on Purpose, and they chatted with dozens of CEOs, and that report identified dealing with uncertainty as one of the top leadership skills of the 21st century.
Right.
And as we've seen over the last 18 months of the pandemic, dealing with uncertainty and pivoting is really, really, really important.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting to look at the relationship between uncertainty and risk, because of course, the classical definition of risk is, something where you can assign a probability. It's a measurable uncertainty, if you accept the circular definition. And uncertainty is something where you just can't assign a probability. It's very related to ambiguity. Like if somebody gives you a big bowl full of yellow and blue balls, if they say it's half yellow and half blue, you can calculate a probability, and then you can take a risk as to what sort of bet you're going to make. But if you don't know the number of yellow and blue balls, it becomes much harder to make that calculation decision. And I think in many cases, the risk values that we assign to things, that the probabilities or the credit ratings or things like that, are an effort to sort of exert some sort of control where we don't necessarily feel control.
Right.
So I think it's important to understand the things that you can control,
Right.
which is your decision-making process, the understanding of your purpose,
Right.
and your priorities, the ability to analyze and recognize what's in front of you. And the more you can do that, the clearer a path you're going to have through uncertain times, but it also involves the ability to give up a certain amount of control. So control what you can and recognize the things where you can't control, and learn to look among those sort of very rough waters for opportunities, for areas where you have a natural advantage, where you can solve a problem, where you can really draw on your strengths, but also if you have weaknesses, who can you turn to
Exactly.
help to, to sort of fill those gaps.
Absolutely. I mean, wonderful set of points, and I hope that more and more executives and youngsters see the importance of it. So viewers, please stay tuned for the second part of this conversation, where Michele and I discuss her latest book, You Are What You Risk, and she already gave you some hints of what she's going to cover in that discussion. So the book, the full title is The New Art and Science of Navigating an Uncertain World. So we will definitely be covering, do people take more risks shortly after eating spicy food? We will talk about risk personalities, how much is nature and nurture, do male traders and high testosterone levels, and do they end up with worse returns? We'll have a lot of interesting things to talk about in second part of the conversation. So stay tuned. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us in yet another episode of Move Conversations. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Please subscribe to the Move Conversations YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get notifications of new episodes. Thank you very much. Till I see you in the next episode. Thank you very much. Have a great day.